presentation of the Interfaith Broadcasting Commission and the National
How about if we
I don't
put
think
it?
this has any sound coming through. I think it's all from here.
Oh, you got it plugged in the TV?
Yeah.
Okay.
Here, do you want us to try it so you can hear it?
No, I thought I heard it coming through the TV too, so that makes sense. So then I should be able to just.
The following program is a presentation of the Interfaith Broadcasting Commission and the National Council of Churches.
Is that it? Yeah. Wherever you want. No. Do you want to put this mic? Do you want to put this mic here for the TV?
Maybe just set it by on the end of the panels and where the speaker is. Probably on the bottom.
I was wondering if we wanted to put this. I mean, it's just fine. I don't care.
It would be better if you didn't worry about that.
Because the speaker's right here.
Okay.
Good morning. Welcome to Trinity. We'll do a little bit of housekeeping, and I'm going to give you a little backstory on how this came about to invite Praire Rose to come and join us and help educate us. But first, Trinity Lutheran Church acknowledges that we gather on the ancestral lands of many nations, including the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz, the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, the Multnomah, the Chinook, and the Clackamas, who continue to care for this land. We thank those whose creation stories are rooted in this place, and we honor the land and its first inhabitants with gratitude and respect. Just a little background on how this started. A couple years ago, the Synodical Women's Organization in Montana had Praire Rose do a workshop for a gathering, and the ladies in Montana invited the board from the Oregon Synodical Women's Organization. So we took the train and went to Montana and had a great time. And so that was my first contact with Praire Rose. And then the Synodical Women of Oregon invited her again just as the pandemic was settling down. And we had a nice little gathering in Salem, and so we got to have more interesting talks with Praire Rose. And then the endowment committee for Trinity, I am on the building relationships committee together with Ruth Parr and Susan Cole and Marty Stevenson. And our fearless leader was Sonia Zeski, who has passed. And so we are continuing carrying on the baton. And we started, in Sonia's honor, we started a Indigenous library, which we're really pretty proud of, and hopefully we'll be getting some books from Praire Rose as soon as they're published. We'll be delving into them. So so that's kind of where that is. The bathrooms are through the fellowship hall and through the fellowship hall here, and then you'll see there's a little hall, and the restrooms are there. There's coffee and sweet treats at the back of the pie, and we'll have lunch at noon. We'll probably break at 11:30, so you can take a little walk, stretch your feet, and our lunch will be served hopefully at noon. They're cooking now, so we spent all night prepping and stuff. So on that note, I will turn it over to Praire Rose. Welcome.
Nawaj dagen that the stigs dani wadada way to go stedin zagadij. My name is Praire Rose Seminole. I greeted you in my Irkra language. I said I'm grateful you are all here for this day we give thanks. I sound like I smoke 5 packs a day because we have wildfires in Western North Dakota, and I have horses, so I have to be out quite a bit every day, and so I'm not sick. Well, maybe a little tired, but if my voice sounds a little shot, that's why. It's just the wildfires. I'm really grateful to come back to Oregon. This is such a wonderful space, and with some amazing women, Stephanie and others, who hosted me during some trying times in my life. When I went to Glacier, absolutely beautiful part of Montana, for the Region 1 Women's Gathering, my clan mother had passed away, like on my way out there. And so an hour before I'm driving into this beautiful, serene, tranquil place, I get the news, and I'm trying to just put on that face to be like, well, we've got really important things. Once somebody passes in our culture and for our clan systems, we have 4 days. So we kind of go into action, and because their spirit leaves us on that 4th day, their body is interned on that 4th day, whether into the ground or into the ashes. So there's a lot of protocol that happens. And I think after the first night we sat down, second morning, or well, our first morning together, I told the organizers what had happened, and I said, I apologize. This is the way I'm coming into this space today, but we're gonna get through today, right? And later that evening, they had shared with other women, like, here's why she's a sad sack walking around. They weren't like that, but it was one of those pieces where they just embraced me at the end of that day, and they let me go home. They still paid me for my commitment, which I told them they didn't have to do. They actually put in extra, so that was nice. They had like tip money on the way back. But it was one of those moments where I was not within my community, but I was embraced by God's family and God's community. And it was really a beautiful moment for, as women, just to come together, knowing those hard times, knowing that we're losing someone important to us, but here's the grace and the space for you to just go and be with your loved ones, right? I don't know what y'all did that next day while I was gone, but I hope it was fun. Hope it was a blast. But it was such a beautiful space. And then to come here to Salem in 2022, actually, October 2022, my younger brother had just moved to Oregon with his then wife. They've since gotten a divorce. It's a whole thing. She took the dog. It's a whole thing. I know. I get to spend time with him tomorrow, though, so I'm really excited about that before I fly out on Monday. But the work that I did within the church, just to give more of an introduction of who I am, I come from a big family. I live in Western North Dakota. The pandemic moved me home to Western North Dakota because I also lost my late brother and inherited his herd of horses, which were 10 horses. Now I have 13. It just really grounded me. And so working for the church-wide organization since 2015, we're traveling 40 weeks out of the year. We're educating large populations that often are not as connected to the work that we're doing with Indigenous ministries and with Native communities, but we're trying to educate so that we all have an opportunity to find that alignment where we're putting our faith in action, we're putting our community and our body within this whole body of the church and who we are as a footprint of the church. That's what I strive to do with my work. So you may hear things today that may bring up emotions. Anger is common, shame, common, guilt, common. But this is not a space for me to be intentionally causing harm to you. It's a shared history that we're learning today. This is a history that we've inherited together, and I want us to move to that future together, right? I'm no longer in my position at the ELCA. I left at the end of the pandemic, mostly because I had these horses to raise and inherited a few more dogs at the time, and I realized I don't want to travel 40 weeks out of the year. I like being grounded. I like being in this space. And I was grieving, so I need to take that time, losing my brother and then losing my late mentor, Gordy Straw, who some may know within the church, he was there for 20-some years. But I'm an educator. I come from a multicultural home. My dad was full-blood American Indian. He was Northern Cheyenne, Arikara, and Dakota. We're just recently connecting to our Dakota heritage that was removed from, you'll hear their story actually in the film later, the first film today, where Minnesotans removed the Dakota from the territories and pushed them west, right? And then there was the Dakota conflict. But my mom is a very devout German from Russia Lutheran. I think they were Lutheran before they even knew it was called Lutheranism. They're very stoic, they're kind of high church Lutheran. So we grew up understanding that protocol. Children were meant to be seen, not heard, right? Like, here's school. That's what drew me actually to my father's side of ceremony and culture, because that allowed us to just be, right? Go experience nature. Go learn lessons the hard way by experiencing it, right? Like, do these things and be in community this way. I'm a twin. This is my twin sister Dakota here. So my mom had 6 kids with my dad, but my dad was previously married. So there's like 14 of us. 11 alive today. We're just starting to lose us, which, we all go through. But it's funny that my dad was in the American Indian movement. So he was a horseman, And one of the things that he brought to the occupation at Wounded Knee, which you'll also learn about a little bit later further, is horses, because they couldn't really travel by vehicles that day with the roadblocks. They had all those federal agents down there, so they brought horses. And a little fun fact, if you didn't know, that at the time the National Indian Lutheran Board was established was the same time that the Civil Rights Movement was happening and the same time that the American Indian Movement was happening. And the National Indian Lutheran Board was funded by the American Lutheran Church, the Lutheran Church in America, and the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. Crazy the Missouri Synod got involved, I have no idea. That was like small miracles, right? But there were Lutherans at the occupation of Wounded Knee. And so this picture is in front of the old store. It's no longer there. My dad's in here, a couple of the American Indian Movement leaders, Clyde Belcourt, Dennis Banks, Russell Means, Carter Camp are like several of the main guys. My dad was just kind of a common Indian, you know, just sometimes you're just a common person that just shows up, right? Like that was kind of my dad in those ways. But up here, there's 3 white guys on the roof. And I didn't know this until I did a presentation on the American Indian Movement at that time. And this guy, I don't know his real name, it's Mike something, but his handle was Meteor Blades. And he was no longer with us, and so I couldn't get more information from him. He died during the pandemic. But he said, those of us, there's 3 Lutherans up there. That's me, and rattled off the names real quick. And it didn't occur to me to like write that down at the moment, because you never think that, oh, we're gonna lose him next year during a pandemic, right? So it's kind of a fun fact to see this picture and knowing faces, but then knowing there's still Lutherans in the back here. The Lutherans showed up, right? In the back. They're always in the back. Culturally in the back. But yeah, Mike and those 2 other guys. So it was kind of fun to have that part of history. So today we're going to talk about relationships, and I wanted to talk about some of the church way we talk about relationships. So I'll just put all these up here. The Lutherans, we're one of the first denominations actually to encounter indigenous people in this country. The first Bible was actually translated in the Lenape language, not the other languages that are out there here in the New World, right? And people really don't know that part of the history. Not the Bible, the Small Catechism, Luther's Catechism. And translated into the Lenape language, and the Swedish church wanted to use that to then actually get more Lutheran followers. But it wasn't translated because they were trying to create more disciples and gain membership in their local churches. It was translated because they had a relationship with the local Lenape people, and they're like, why? They noticed the black cloak. Why is he just talking to everybody? He just goes everywhere and just talks to everybody. Anybody know a pastor who just all they do is talk to everybody? Just kidding. But they were curious. What are those conversations about? Well, it's about faith. It's about God. Well, what do you believe, right? What is your faith? Who is your God, right? And so it wasn't a translation of a text to convert. It was a translation of a text to communicate and to build relationships with. And that was one of those pieces that I think we should really be proud of as Lutherans, is that we didn't come here to change minds and get people. We came here to survive, but we also came here to just build a new home. And we're doing that with the help of the local indigenous peoples. We kind of forgot about that history as governments established and power took over, and relationships didn't matter so much as the immediate need of needing land and resources, right? But I think that's a point of pride that we can have, at least at that time, before, being marched west, right? Because we had our monks within the Swedish church and others walk with the Cherokee, walk with the dozens of other tribes that were forced to march west, just to kind of continue that relationship. They were there, they showed up, we were on that walk, we fed each other, right? We buried our dead together, right? So these pieces of our history are often an accompaniment, and more than just being a witness, it's true relationships. But again, we've gotten away from that. So I wanted to start with kind of that piece of our history to where we are today. So we do have over 30 Native congregations around the country. And we're open to new faith communities as well. We are one of those areas of growth, but the church has changed in its structure and its funding and how we operate as ministries. Because ministries didn't really come into Indian country in the way of like, hey, join us, give us your money and your resources, right? It was much more of a land grab. We took what we wanted, and I'm not saying the Lutherans did that in general, but we benefited from that system of taking and extraction and assimilation. So I like to start with this picture. This is one of the Indian agents at the time in the South Dakota Territory with Chief Red Cloud. And I've broken this up with Lutheran trivia throughout this morning, just to wake everybody up too, but there is some components of interactive engagement here. So what do you see when you look at this picture? No wrong answers. The height difference? What was that? No, I mean, the Indian agent's shaking Red Cloud's hand, you know. What do you see if you were witnessing this interaction today? We'll get to that, Ruth, come on. We'll get to that, hold on. Yeah, nobody ever smiled in pictures back then. You weren't allowed to. Camera broke if you did. Just kidding. Yeah. So what if I told you that both of these individuals are acting culturally appropriate from their respective cultures, right? It was respectful to be seated when greeting company. It was respectful to not look you in the eye because that was something that's very intimate, right? That was reserved for relatives and close relationships, right? And, but from the Indian agent's perspective, greet you with a firm handshake, look you directly in the eye, right? Now, how well do you think you communicated at those points of intersection, those points where our lives intersected, and we had to build a future together, right? Who's listening to who? Who's respecting who? This guy comes in with his ideas I know are gonna work for you. This guy comes in with, we've been doing it this way for so long and they've been working, right? How well do you think those negotiations went? Not the best for Native people, right? But dominant culture came in like a wrecking ball and came in, a rudeness. There's just a lot of miscommunication that happens when your social cues and how to behave, interact with one another are different from the culture that you're trying to engage and build a future with together, right? So I like starting with this picture because it allows us to have that understanding, like we're not all coming from the same lived experience. We're not all coming from the same culture, right? But as dominant culture establishes itself, especially in this country, and what we've established here within our church, there's a way that we've operated, and it's worked, and some of it hasn't, right? But how are we becoming that church that we're called to be in this new era, right? The world is vastly changing very quickly outside of the doors of this church and elsewhere. And we, inside, haven't changed as quick, right? Because this is our comfort place. This is our comfort zone. Zombie apocalypse happens, we're staying right here. Like, this is what we know, how we can survive together. We know who's gonna pick up the coffee, we know who's gonna do all these things, right? And we even have the guys who are gonna take out the salamanders or the mice that come in the building. Like, we know who's taking care of that stuff. We had to move a salamander the other day, so. So what does it mean to be in relationship? Especially now that the church has repudiated the doctrine of discovery, which we'll look at in a little bit here. We're stepping into this new era. And the director of Indigenous Ministries, Vance Blackfox, a friend of mine, who is leading that and doing a lot of education online. So if you haven't gotten to attend his Indian 101 or some of the other pieces that have continued from the work and my predecessors have all done, we're building on that foundation. Because when I stepped into the role, Nobody had been in that role consistently for more than 3 months for over 8 years. So what kind of relationships do you think we're building when there's nobody in the position, right? And the position is very top down. We know what Churchwide is going to do for you at the grassroots level, and when your foundation and engagement with this church hasn't been necessarily one to build your own community, but rather we've told you what your community is, right? How well are you going to thrive in that environment? So a lot of my work was relationship building, not just with our native communities, but with the whole church, all 4 million of us, right? It's a lot of us. But when you take out all of the ordained leadership, because that's who we focus on as leadership in our church, there's still 4 million of us, right? Those of us who are showing up day after day, holding our community together, holding our congregation together. We know who's planning the special speakers coming in, who's picking up the coffee. When someone dies, we know exactly what role we're taking on to show up for that community and the bereaved, right? We have an operating system that works for us. But that doesn't always work for the communities who've never had a say in how they can create that operating system. So there's a lot of work for us to do. So our work now, it's grounded in reconciliation and the mutual building up of the saints. That's the language that we use in the church. I don't know what that means. Just kidding. But it's language that, like, who writes this? Does this come from the community? Right? Did the community write, we need to build up the saints? How do we do this? For me, that first step was to ask the communities, how are you church here? What is your church? Right? Church in Shishmaref, Alaska versus Portland, Oregon, very different, right? Church in Rocky Boy, Montana and Bismarck, North Dakota, even though they're considered both rural, still very different, right? So what is church in our community? How is church in our community? Is church done to us? A lot of Native communities, church is just done to us. How do we build that up, right? Rocky Boy, by the way, just to bring it up, they had this beautiful wooden Jesus statue, native Jesus, for years and years and years and years and years. And these storms and these wildfires recently brought it down. So they're trying to memorialize that now, but I just sent them a picture from our gathering in 2018 where the sun rays were kind of coming up behind the Jesus. And I was like, this is epic. So I took a picture, and that's what I sent it. And I kind of forgot about it until they posted, hey, our Jesus has fallen. We're going to memorialize Jesus by, getting the best picture out there and putting it up in the sanctuary. But our Jesus is gone now. Yeah, it kind of makes me sad, because that was a local artist who carved Jesus out of a local tree. And if you know the history of Rocky Boy, Montana, it's the the Stone Child community. They didn't build a church to be a part of any denomination. They built a church because, well, maybe if we pray like them, they'll leave us alone. Because at that time, you had logging, you had gold rush, you had all these settlers coming in, people land grabbing. Maybe if we pray like them, they'll leave us alone. Wasn't so much the case. That denomination, that church eventually became a part of the Lutheran denomination, where we said, well, we'll take care of you. We'll provide pulpit, we'll provide a pastor. And for the longest time, they ran a camp. It was one of those camps where white folks would come in by the busloads and look at the poor natives, fix a fence, make some bunk beds, maybe build a ramp to somebody's house so they have access. But as my late mentor used to call it, it was just like a trip to the zoo. It was not about building relationship. It was not about reconciliation or building up of the saints, right? It was about us feeling good about ourselves and what we can do for those poor natives, right? When I came into the position, there was a pastor there, phenomenal woman in her own right, but she was very introverted and not much of a community builder. She would do church, that was her role. She would oversee funerals and marriages and this camp. She didn't mind the camp because then her people could come in and like see everything, and but it wasn't really working for the community. The community, time and time again, would invite her, come to our Quilters come to our local events, come to this community gathering, come sew with us, come sit with us, come eat with us, right? And they never were taking up on the offer of like going into community to engage more. So I get in this job in 2016, and I had already been in somewhat the quasi role since like 2015. And I knew this pastor, and I met them in Oklahoma at a Native gathering, where the Native gatherings for us also includes the non-Natives who serve our congregations. So everybody's still welcome to be at these gatherings. And I won't say their name because they live out here, I think, in Oregon now, or maybe it's Washington State. They live somewhere here on the beautiful northwest area of the country. But the pastor was just very introverted and not one to engage too much. So how is it going? And then you've got this incredible group of lay leaders who came from Rocky Boy, all saying, we're doing this, and we're doing this, and we've got this going on, and the camp is coming up, and we're just, we've got the room where they're going to paint this room 3 times, and they're going to build this ramp, and they're going to build bunk beds. They paint the room 3 times because they have nothing else for them to do in the community, right? We're going to have a mini powwow. We're going to do all this stuff, show them, because people love it when we sing and dance. I was like, where are we building relationships with the church-wide organization? And there just wasn't anything. So what's the relationship with church-wide? At that time, it was that we funded most of the Native ministries at a certain level, and that money would go through their synod and with relationship with the director of evangelical mission, and oftentimes certain parameters had to be met. I didn't like this kind of model. I think funding should be community-led, community-driven. This is what we need it for. If they needed to fix a broken down bus, or install a heater, let them use that money for whatever they want to use it. So we found this endowment that was created decades ago, and we thought it was about $40,000. And this endowment had structure that was set up in an old model of the ELCA where those positions no longer existed. I know I'm getting into the bureaucracy here, but stick with me, it's important. And so it took about a year for us to be like, okay, let's get access to this endowment because it's for Native ministries, but these positions no longer exist, so it all had to go to church council, and it went en bloc, thankfully. But then we discovered, there's another body of money related to this fund that has to go through church council again. So it took about 18 months for the cycle to get all this money into the hands of community members. What we thought was $40,000 was $400-some thousand. Yeah, but that was, get this, that was the income account. So that was where only a quarter of the interest from this larger pool of money went every quarter. So it was feeding itself. It was feeding the income account and then feeding itself from the interest. And that, by the time I left my position, we had raised even more money for the principal account, which was I think about $1.3 million at the time that I left the church in 2020. I don't know what they're doing with that money then, now, excuse me, but then we decided to give this no strings attached money to communities because they needed an infusion of cash. Almost all of our Native ministries are working in poverty. They're working in relationships that have those strings attached to money, right? And the community knows how to use that money best, right? There were very few situations where they didn't necessarily have a plan, right? But most often they had a plan. They knew how to use that money. We're going to use it to send kids to the youth gathering. We're going to use it to send our lay leaders to this team program so that they can become pastors if they want to become pastors, right? So we're going to set up these different channels and access to funding. To me, that is much more rooted in the idea of reconciliation. Like, how do we want to repair this relationship from the harm that we've caused? But the mutual building up of saints, like I said, I don't really know what that means, but I think it should be building up our community members just as much, right? How does the community guide us into these things? Sharing in that then work, establishing a common vision, lifting up the work of the ministries and how best they do that, because not all of them are word and sacrament. Not all of them are how we engage our church, right? Some of us just go to church on Sunday, sometimes go to things throughout the week or the month, but some of us, church isn't that big of a deal. But in all these rural communities, church is still center. It doesn't look like the center in how we once idealized and romanticized church being center of our communities, but is still center, feeding us, grieving with us, celebrating with us the birth and weddings in our local community. But we're not always doing it in the same name of like, I'm a Lutheran, I'm getting married in a Lutheran church, right? We don't always speak in the same way. So we've established shared work as much as we can, as best as we can, and especially in times where we need to change the way church has been done. So one of the congregations we inherited in northern Alaska, it was under the Presbyterian denomination for a while. And they sent a guy. You probably heard some of these things about different denominations, and we probably have them in our denomination as well, but we've got predators. And in those days, especially when you had the attitude that white is right, and we're gonna come in and do church this way, and this is how we do discipline, not always the best foot stepping into a rural indigenous community, one who has no relationship with the Christian faith. And so the first experience they have with the Christian faith is a predator, right? And these elders talked about a silence that happened. They said, we never had silence like this. All of a sudden the children were quiet. All of a sudden these teenage women were quiet, right? And then they started to unearth these stories about this predator of a priest. And 3 young men, this should be a movie, by the way. I'm gonna write this movie. 3 young men took it upon themselves to end the silence, because to abuse people in the village was a capital punishment. But to kill somebody in the village was also a capital punishment. And so the justice system didn't work. When the people out east came to evaluate the priest, the people said, he's hurting our children, he's hurting our young women. And the priest was like, I am not hurting them. I am giving them God. I am their relationship to Jesus, right? So again, a system not created for the people, by the people, but to benefit this predator priest in the community. They told on him and they were punished, right? So the leaders go back to the east and the priest is still there. And that's when these 3 young men decide, well, we can't have a predator in our community, native or not. This abuse is not natural. And so they harpooned the guy. Took him out on the sea ice and harpooned him. I think they harpooned him and then took him on the sea ice. I don't really know that whole part. I wasn't there. But these young men also knew their fate. And so they got to choose. Because they did this on behalf of the community let them choose how they each would then go on to the next world. The church, the Presbyterian church at the time, I don't even know if they still don't know a lot of this history, but the family sent a huge statue of the priest to the community in northern Alaska. And so there's a statue of this guy out there. And so the Lutheran Church, we inherited this congregation in the 80s or early 90s, I forget, around that time. And it wasn't until 2017, their spring conference, and that was my first time in Alaska, and these villagers from this community said, can we change our name? Because their congregation is also named after this guy. Now, mind you, how many years, how many decades have passed since this incident happened, since they've come into our church, and they still felt that they needed permission to become the church that they're called to be. And I was like, you don't need our permission. You can change your name tomorrow if you want. It's only been, so that was 2017, and in 2023, they're finally working on like changing the name. Because the to their credit, they wanted to go through proper channels. They wanted to make sure that the synod was okay with it. And so the synod was dragging their feet because they didn't really know how to like give permission. And I'm like, just give permission. Just say yes, change whatever you want, right? Sometimes we build up these things like, why are we making it so hard, right? So I'm curious to still find out the end of the story, like what did they change their name to? And did they send the statue back? I'm sure they need money to send the statue back, but those pieces of being community-led, community-driven, how we are to be church today. If you want to change your name tomorrow. Like, it doesn't matter, right? How are we church together? So again, sharing that work, nurturing and upholding the dignity of American Indian Alaska Native people, what it means to be in their congregation, in their communities, and the church, right? That's how it should be, community-driven. So when we talk about service to accompaniment, it's not necessarily our idea. This is how I'm gonna show up, right? How do you need me to show up? What is best, right? Sometimes that is your time. Sometimes that is your talent. Sometimes it's your resources, right? My community is doing a wild call right now because of the fires. You know, we need feed, we need hay, we need water, we need all these things, right? We need firefighters, right? There's different needs that we have at different times in the journey of our lives, but how are we showing up for the way that people want to have us there? So that's my spiel on service to accompaniment. I know you looked at this slide and were like, that's a lot of words, so many words. You didn't know you're getting a fun story about being harpooned on the ice, did you? All right, trivia time. Name the current bishop of the ELCA, presiding bishop. Elizabeth Eaton, yeah. I told you I mixed this up with some trivia. See how good Lutherans you are? How many synods are there in the ELCA? Someone said 60? Yeah. 65. All right, so I was just at Augustana in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. That's where the synod office is as well for the South Dakota Synod. And I was there for this Native gathering, which was kind of a funny Native gathering because there was a lot of non-Natives at this Native gathering. I think they took it a little too far, in my opinion, on like embracing non-Natives in some of the sense. It was a Canadian group that had come down, and they wanted to lift up some of the history of Augustana. So I told you that when the National Indian Lutheran Board was being established by these three denominations, it took about a year. So they met in South Dakota, and then in 68 or 69 is when the National Indian Lutheran Board was funded by those three denominations. But looking at accompaniment, those three denominations came with an agenda saying, this is what we're gonna do. We're gonna talk about it at our next, church-wide gatherings and assemblies and make a decision from there. And the natives were like, why are we here? Why aren't we doing our own agenda, right? So when you see things like this, 40 Indians seize South Dakota dormitory. Well, they needed a place to stay to make their agenda, right? Plus, school wasn't going on at the time, but it was just kind of funny, the headlines of this time, and was it as aggressive as media makes it to be? It wasn't, right? So it was a shared dialogue around these pieces, but the reality was the natives needed their own agenda, and so they took that time, they went back to meet with these folks with an agenda saying, you need to be a part of reparations, you need to be a part of this work, and you need to put your resources behind it. Because at that time, those denominations were very wealthy, especially having come from largely white settlement cultures within the Dakotas and Minnesota and Wisconsin. Those areas had resources. So the natives came back and, keep it on that one for a minute, with an agenda, and they all went back to their denominations, made the decisions, and then they created the National Indian Lutheran Board, which we'll learn about a little bit later here. Let's see where we are in time. Okay. So at the time, the occupation of Wounded Knee was happening. Alcatraz had started just previous to this, and then the occupation at Wounded Knee in the late 70s. National Indian Lutheran Board was established. National Indian Lutheran Board was funding a lot of the community organizing happening across the country. And they funded little projects, seed money from $500 to $3,000, which at that time was a lot of money, to support the women in these communities, to educate each other, to organize, to provide childcare, meals, kind of similar to what like the Black Panther movement did within their communities of like having their own schools established, doing a lot of the direct service from their own mutual aid network. That's what the National Indian Lutheran Board really established, is that mutual aid network component. But what was happening is that you saw the pictures like this of all the men. You didn't see a lot of the pictures behind the scenes of women organizing, educating, non-natives, going into congregations, having women's circles, and just having conversation. Like, what does it be, me and a woman in South Dakota in '73 during this occupation with our view of Native people at this time? Because the view of Native people in the media wasn't necessarily the best. So you didn't see all the behind the scenes, behind the work happening. And actually when they did the Million Indian March on Washington, the National Indian Lutheran Board kind of funded a lot of those caravans, provided homestays and congregations across the country. I mean, it was really active. And they involved like the Catholic Church too in some ways. There's like a progressive group of Catholics that are out there. I've met a few who said, I remember that. We didn't have a Lutheran church, but we had Catholic church, and so we organized them to stay here. We fed them and gave them water and stuff like that. So the National Lutheran Board, founded in 1970, contained board members from the denominations of the American Lutheran Church in America, Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and then the Association of Evangelical Lutheran Churches joined in '78, and it just kind of grew from there. But this was community-led organizing and funded at the national level. The leader, Eugene Crawford, which is this gentleman here, you can't see well, but you'll see him later in the film, was kind of holding everybody together. And at this time, you were also seeing this really unique thing happen across Native leadership, where those were Native leaders starting to go through seminary, and lay leadership was really establishing on the groundwork happening in their communities. And that dynamic still has an impact today of like those who are ordained and those who are not, right? Like our church looks at leadership and structures leadership around ordained leadership. Yet we know much of our work is happening with lay leadership, right? So how are we really recognizing that lay leadership happening across the footprint of our church? And not just in Native ministries, in all our ministries, right? It's the lay leadership that really keeps us going, but we need that leader. We're very centered on that. Like, you need to make decisions. Just tell me what to do. I'll show up, just tell me what to do, right? All of us love that. Just tell me what to do. I don't know how to be an adult. Like, someone pay my bills. Just tell me what to do. And that's sometimes what we need, right? Like, especially when you were looking at building relationships, it's the whole point of today. When we're looking at building relationships, sometimes we need to be told what to do. Just show up sometimes. Feed me, fund me, right? I was telling Stephanie, like, was I talking to you, Stephanie, or was it Gavin this morning too? It was like, we have a dynamic happening where I am because oil is out there. So 10% of the allotment families on my reservation now receive like oil money. I don't. I know what my dad gave me after he died. Like, it's not oil money. We get some oil money, but it's nothing to quit your day job over. But there are some families who get tens, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars a month. So we have this really unique dynamic, of like those who are getting like incredibly wealthy very fast, and those of us who are not going to be very wealthy very fast, right? And it's really interesting because that's happening to some of my peers, where they didn't know their parents were millionaires because these elders in their 70s and 80s are passing, not telling anybody that they were millionaires. They just didn't know how to be millionaires. So they just kept living their lives, quiet, simple, routine, and they pass, and now their children are finding out that they had millions of dollars in their bank account because of oil money. And so now these people my age are becoming these millionaires, or will be within the next few years because of oil money, and nobody knows how to act around each other. I'm like, buy me a barn. but it's going to be really interesting over the next few years to see how that's going to change everything. Because we have, the crisis of fentanyl is in our communities right now. Meth and fentanyl are just taking over. I was telling Steph I have active addicts in my own family, and that's really disruptive. But how do you keep, moving forward, especially when there's so much access to it? Because this money is coming in, now there's so much access to all these things that are just really detrimental to community. I want to be romantic and hold on to these values of like community and family and how we do these things together, but then you have these disruptions, and money is one of those disruptions sometimes. But money can also be, somewhat of a good thing, and I think it put us on a good trajectory with the Lutheran Church, getting us back on track there, in how we started working within Indian country. So people applied for grants across the country, and so Keeley Radio out of South Dakota is one of the grants, and it's still going on today. Native Connections out of Phoenix, Arizona, one of the biggest urban Indian healthcare facilities in the country, started by National Lutheran Board money, right? Like those pieces that we have like threaded our way through, but then we've forgotten it, right? When I was in Sacramento, I got to talk with a bunch of young people about our kind of Lutheran history, and they're like, is this written anywhere? And I was like all in one place? No, it's not. And they're like, you should write that book. And so that's what I'm working on, Stephanie, is putting it all in one spot. It's a little boring though. I'm like, can get very verbose. So the National Indian Lutheran Board, this is taken from the film. I like showing this because this was the last time the National Indian Lutheran Board got together. It was in Fargo, North Dakota, and it was, I think, 87 or 88, because it was like right before Gene Crawford passed away. And like I said, he was the guy like holding everything together. You know how we kind of build this like leader-focused structures around those leaders? And when we lost him, everything just fell apart. We didn't know who was talking to who's communicating where. Like there were lists, there were, it was way before email. It was mostly lists and partnerships and different things that were written. But when you operate kind of in a way of pre-computer and formalized database systems, it was pretty loose, right? So the church has lost all of that knowledge when they lost Gene Crawford. But I'm in here, where am I? Let's see, that's me here. It's my older sister Cheyenne, my younger sister Dakota, younger sister Tishina, my little brother Ree. My dad's in here. Let's see, let's find Waldo here. Anyway, he's in here. My mom was in the kitchen helping everybody like cook. So we're missing like a group of women. This is Gene Crawford right there. My dad is in here somewhere, but I forget. And I remember one of these blurs is my brother, so. But yeah, we're all here. And this was such a fascinating picture because there's some of the leaders from Alaska, from Navajo Nation, across the country, all gathered here. And just, it's a historic opportunity to be like seeing this at that time, right? And I'm like, that's me. I didn't even know I was in there. But I actually remember this gathering. We were all the kids were just always running around everywhere. But the adults were, I'm sure, really productive. I don't remember that part. So, but that was the last time the National Indian Lutheran Board gathered. And we haven't had a gathering that big since. So, all right, outside of Germany, the United States has the largest population of Lutherans, followed by Ethiopia and Tanzania. True or false? Barely true. Yep. We're still number one, but Tanzania and Ethiopia are fastly coming behind us. Fastest growing population. It's interesting too because the church that is establishing across the African continent is High Church. It's really weird to me. I was like, no, get away from High Church. You don't need it. But it's allowing for like some corrupt dynamics to be established. Which is unfortunate, but there are still elements of like community-driven church there, but we're still going through this journey. Yeah. High Church, oh, the High Lutheran Church. You've not experienced High Lutheran Church? Shame on you, shame, shame, shame. I know this was a no shame or blame environment, but shame on you, just kidding. No, High Church is all the formality, the pomp, the process, very patriarchal. The ceremony, you know, you might have all the choral, you know, every instrument, symphony. Yeah, very formal, very formal. Yep. No open-toed shoes. So, just kidding. No short sleeves. High church can be very beautiful. I've attended a service in Austria one time that was high church, and it was around Christmas, and it was just absolutely beautiful. But I think there's, you know, a lot of ceremony put around things that cost our church a lot, and I'm a big fan of not feeding the wealthy off of the labor of the people. So, all right, what was the first year of the ELCA? Oops. Nobody? Oops, what am I doing here? Slideshow. I think it was 89. Hey Siri, what was the first year of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America? No, Siri doesn't know either. She said the Evangelical Lutheran Church existed from 1917. Oops. I usually know these by heart, but I didn't stock up on my own trivia. But I think it was 89 or 88? No, that's not true. Hold on. We are bad Lutherans if we don't know this. Yeah, 1988. Because we were organizing, and the churchwide assembly that was like, we need to allow women to be ordained, right? That was the huge blow up. Oh, I didn't do it. We need to allow women to be ordained. Steph, I need tech support. Press input on your remote. And that's what started the huge conversation across the country, right? Like, women shouldn't be ordained. Yes, women should be ordained. Like, can you imagine our church if we didn't allow women to be ordained? And so that's where our denominations kind of came together. We lost, I think, was it 30% of the Lutherans at that time to become the ELCA? And every like big major shift at that time. Oh, you know what? I bet you my battery's dead. Yeah, there we go. 1 second. It's in here somewhere. Do we have power? Yeah, no worries.
The extension cord? Right here. Oh, you got it.
Yep.
Okay, we're in.
This little spot right there.
Can you move it a little more towards me?
Yeah, we're gonna have a break here pretty soon, and then we'll watch a short film, and then we'll have another break, because the short film, I want you to kind of digest it a little bit before lunch. But the ELCA has continued to have tough conversations, right? I think when we look at how we were founded within the principles of the Reformation and challenging that whole system, even challenging capitalism to a degree, right? But we just get so comfortable with how we're processing things that we forget to challenge things and start and reflecting on everything. We got to give ourselves those spaces. So a couple of things this afternoon. We're going to be doing a writing activity, and we'll be watching another short film, the short film that I co-directed on missing and murdered Indigenous relatives, and we can have a conversation about that and how that's showing up in our communities outside of the reservations. And then we'll kind of close off the day by sharing stories and talking about the work of the church. And I got to put a book list together for everybody. So let's see here. Now it doesn't want to. Oops, just kidding. It says you should break right now. Just kidding. Actually, we can do that though. Let's break for 10 minutes and then we'll come back and we'll watch the film because the film is about an hour. So yeah, take a break, get coffee, snacks, and come back, get comfortable, and we'll watch the film.
The only thing that doesn't work well when we find out how crazy it is with the movie is we get that the annoyance you get when you pull the camera on the TV screen. People start twitching and take a break.
I always saw the problem as in two ways.
All right, let's bring it back, folks. Just to refresh. And if you want to get to a place where you can see the TV better, I encourage that because we're going to watch a short film here. Well, this one's long. This one's the longer of the two films. It's about an hour long. So yeah, if you want to get to a place where you can see the TV better. Again, remember, the first year of the ELCA, this is really recent. This is in most of our lived histories, right? And so what we're also going to learn about with the film is not necessarily talking about the doctrine of discovery, right? It'll be like the reasons why we're getting more involved with Native ministries now, I think. But as a church, so we were one of the last denominations to repudiate the doctrine of discovery. There's still many more out there that need to, but if you've not looked into the doctrine of discovery, these papal bulls, this memo that went out, like here's how we're going to treat indigenous peoples, look into it, because sure, we can repudiate it, but what is it? Why did we repudiate it? Because I was the organizer who, I don't know how many synods I traveled to that year. In 2016, because it was Churchwide Assembly 2017, Churchwide Assembly 2016 that we repudiated the doctrine of discovery. But in 2015 and 2016, my big part of my role was organizing, community organizing around repudiation of doctrine of discovery. I sent videos to a bunch of synod assemblies, so like my giant head was like in there saying, we need to do this, but because I only had 3 minutes, couldn't really get into unpacking why we should do this, right? This doctrine is rooted in just the bleaching of the world, right? Those hateful understandings of how we view indigenous peoples across the globe and how we're just gonna take, really, giving the permission to just take. So I look at the work that we've done in this church, and this was written, the repudiation, the language itself is on our website at the ELCA. You can just Google it or go to the elca.org.com website and see a lot of this work. But the synods that moved forward with it, we kind of had to hijack the bishops' convention, the fall of 2015. I wasn't even hired. We totally hijacked it. Guess what we did to get them there? We were like, hey, come have lunch with us. How do you get a Lutheran into a place? You feed them, right? So it was the fall of 2015, bishops' convention and gathering in Chicago, Illinois, and a bunch of us Native ministry leaders were there, and we're like, we need to do this. The Episcopals did it years ago. The Unitarians are doing this. The Presbyterians have even done this, and we know how bad they are. Just kidding, we never said that. But this is a conversation that's peaked, and we're not having this conversation. So we need to do this now. And so we kind of came in educating those bishops. About 25 of the bishops showed up out of the 65, and we started with, here we are as Native leaders in the church. Here's how many ministries we have active right now. Here's the relationship that we really haven't had with Native ministries. Oh, and by the way, this piece of documentation from the Catholic Church, from the papal bulls, the 1500s or 1400s, 1500s that allowed for all this to be established, and it's still in our governing documents as the United States of America. This is how it's caused us all this harm. We need to repudiate it. And there were those within that assembly who were not necessarily aligned, right? They wanted to educate themselves more about it, and that's fine. Go educate yourselves. You have a year, right? Because next year in 2016 at the Churchwide Assembly, this is going to move forward because we already had commitments from the Montana Synod with Bishop Christ at the time, and some other synods whose leadership was fully supportive of this movement. So whether it was going to be the 1 or the 20, we're going to move forward no matter what. It was a lot of education. And so we do this like Indian 101 at synod assemblies and different gatherings, and there was a lot of hostility because when you challenge like the governing documents of whiteness, You're challenging whiteness. And if you've benefited from being in a white body, you're going to take that as an affront as well, right? So I would actually have people come up to me very hostile and say, are you saying I got to give my land back? Well, that's what my button says, right? Land back. Not now, right? But eventually, maybe, right? It's a conversation we have to have, right? It's not saying I need this done right now, but here's this document that we need to just pull from our governing bodies of as a faith organization, because we do not feel that we have a place in this church as long as we're governed by bodies that believe this is how you should treat Indigenous people, right? How can we be church together if you don't think I should even be here? If you don't even think I'm a human being, right? And so those conversations, although largely educational, were very, the labor, the emotional labor really fell on us as Native leaders across the footprint of this church to educate our white-bodied partners in this church to understand what it means to be Native in a church like this, and what it means to be Native in a country like the United States that hasn't looked at us, right? So 2016, we had 912 yes votes, 28 nays, and I could go around the room and tell you who they were, just kidding. We had a few. But one of the pieces I would leave folks with, and I'll email Steph this for your reading list, because this is available online, free as a resource, and a lot of places print it out and have it available, and you can print it out and put it in your library. It's just a short PDF on liberation theology. And this was written back in 89, I think. Yeah, 89. By Robert Allen Woyer, and this was just something that we wanted to educate people just to think differently, right? What does it mean to be liberated? From whose definition of liberation are we liberating people, right? And it isn't necessarily relevant to today in the sense of this is what we're still dealing with, but it's relevant in today's terms of like where some of us we're still dealing with, right? So it's a good piece on the Canaanites, Cowboys, and Indians. And broad brushstroke is that if you were living in the land of Canaan, who would you identify most with, the Cowboys or the Indians, right? For as Indigenous peoples, we're the Canaanites, right? We're the current Philistines, Palestinians, who are being removed in acts of genocide because of somebody's godliness claim to land, right? And so these are conversations that we need to have, because who's right, right? So that's that connection to that piece as Indigenous people, because there's a lot of Native leaders out there who say we're first disciples, and there's a lot of things out there. But we're very modern day, current people. A few of these folks we've since lost since this picture was taken, but our American Indian Last Native Ministries and our leaders, we're vibrant. We're still here. We're in this church. We're wanting to establish community. And when we're looking at today's theme about building relationships, how we're doing that within church and within the context of who we are as Native people, meaning I can walk through this door as my whole self versus I have to leave a piece of myself out there to walk into this room, right? And I'm very grateful in spaces like this. I can come here as my whole self. I can laugh and cry and joke with you all and be that my whole self. But there are other spaces across the footprint of this church where I can't do that, right? And I challenge that system. So even though we've created documents on both the repudiation of the Doctrine of Discovery, and then we've made the declaration of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America to American Indian and Alaska Native people in 2021, these are commitments that we're making, but this needs to come to the front lines of the church. That means everybody in the pew to have these conversations and know that we're doing this, because not all of us are going to be around to see that day of, you know, hallelujah, kumbaya, we're here together, getting along, peaceful, right? No more violence. That's probably not going to happen in my own lifetime, but I can be a part of the movement, and how I show up I think is important. How we all show up is important within our lifetimes and what we can do. So again, just be aware of the Doctrine of Discovery. I mean, it's a lot. Those Catholics get very verbose. But we're making this commitment as a church to step into these spaces. So we have a unique history with American Indian Alaska Native populations, and we say American Indian Alaska Natives because that's how the US government tracks us. The movement is now moving to Indigenous peoples, which recognizes all Indigenous peoples. But when I started, it was more of American Indian Alaska Natives because we recognize the federal relationship with Indigenous peoples and the unique political class of people of Indigenous peoples in this. And so when we were looking at these videos, Native Nations Standing Together is one that the ELCA created years ago, and I hope we can find some funding to actually kind of do an act 2. Sid Bean, the producer and director of this, is still around in Minneapolis, Minnesota, has a ton of footage on the ground. I would just love to have that funding. So if any of you have $400,000, we can get that video made.
I always saw the problem as too.
I don't know why that starts in that such an odd spot. So this is about an hour, and afterward,
The following
will take a
program
break.
is a presentation of the Interfaith Broadcasting Committee.
and then we should have lunch at noon. So, and then after lunch, we'll kind of debrief and talk more of the film and get into some other pieces. So.
And the National Council of Churches.
The 1960s was a time of discontent and social unrest, a time when the ignored and the forgotten stood up and demanded their civil rights. For Native Americans, the awakening was 500 years in coming.
We, of course, chained up all the doors and locked them. Nobody could get in. You know, there was a lot of people on the outside that supported us.
We took Alcatraz because we felt as students that we were strong enough to make our voice heard. The 60s was an exciting time because the change was really taking place in the whole United States with the civil rights movement. Then Indians became empowered by the war and poverty programs. New leadership was emerging from the communities. I felt like I'm a product of that.
I was drawn to the movement of the time, which was the movement towards Indian self-determination and Indian sovereignty. And as we sought our own political identity and our own political power, we had to control our programs and our services. After we met in Sioux Falls for the second meeting in 1970, and we organized a national board, cross-section of Indian people, from young activists to tribal officials, from very extreme sort of protest groups to very conservative Indian people in grassroots communities.
When looking specifically at Native civil rights, there are many stories of unjust incidents. For the Minnesota Dakota, one story predominates. In 1862, when part of the nation was preoccupied by civil war, the struggle for civil rights is frozen in this photograph.
The largest mass hanging in the history of the United States. And then when we talk about the history of what happened from that time to the present, it's a tremendous history, and it's a lot of emotion, a lot of feelings, go very, very deep with our people, with me.
My Dakota ancestors were living a very natural life in which everything was related. The land provided them their food, their shelter, their religion, their very way of life. That natural life was coming in conflict with colonial civil society, where power was dominant and everything was separate.
For quite a few years before 1862, there had been tensions building up in the community on the Dakota side, particularly. The Dakota had given up a lot of land and had been pushed by the settlers to a narrow strip of land along the Minnesota River.
They agreed to deliver annuities and provisions as a part of the treaty. But there was a civil war on, and delivery of goods and annuities to a small tribe got very low priority.
Our people are starving, our children, our elders. The cornfields failed the last year of '61. They didn't have any corn to eat. Finally, the young warriors in their society got together and say, look, we have to do something like this. Let's go to war.
August 17th, 1862. War breaks out between the Dakota and the United States. From southern Minnesota, the Dakota rose up. The war lasted several weeks, and the Dakota, overwhelmed, had no choice but to surrender. Records show more than 500 soldiers, settlers, women, and children died, but with no concise account for the number of dead Dakota.
It was the largest kangaroo court. Some of them only took a few minutes. All of the men were found guilty to hang by the neck until dead.
The military didn't view the Dakota as a sovereign people fighting a war, and instead they were viewing them simply as individuals out killing and robbing. And I think it was an important element in Lincoln's decision that he had to execute some significant number of individuals in order to show that there were consequences for what had happened in the war.
Lincoln pardoned all but 39, and eventually there was one that they let go at the last minute.
On that fateful day, the prisoners were led out of the prison. They were shackled, chained together, and had hoods. Dakota women began wailing and weeping. One of the prisoners, hearing them, in a loud voice said, "Mitakuepi namakupo." Hear me, my people. Today is not a day of defeat. It is indeed a day of victory. For we have made a peace with our Creator and now go to be with Him forever. So remember this day to tell our children so they can tell their children that we are honorable men who die for a noble cause. Do not mourn for us. Rejoice with us. It's a good day to die. And then he began lifting up his voice and began singing.
The civil rights movement, starting in the 1960s, as defined by community organizer Bob Moses, has two distinct traditions. There was the community mobilizing tradition, directed at large-scale, short-term public events, best known through the freedom marches led by the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. The other tradition was directed at long-term development through community organizing with ordinary men and women.
We were in the Deep South, and when they learned that I was a clergyman, one of the guys said, "Sid, why don't you help your own people?" I said, the black civil rights struggle is a struggle for all oppressed people, not just blacks. And that was Martin Luther King's philosophy. If I'm willing to be a part of the military to fight for this country, I ought to be willing to die for my own people and for the people who are oppressed.
Growing up on a small reservation in South Dakota and visiting a lot of the other reservations, I could see the anger and the frustration that elder people had, but they were not expressing it outward. the young people were beginning to express it outward through acts of personal destruction. And I used to see young men who would drink and go out and literally beat their hands against the wall until there was nothing but flesh and blood as a way to vent their frustration.
Becoming acquainted with the new movement, I think what interested me was the people that were involved, the young, educated, non-educated thought of what the truth about what happened to American Indian people in the last 500 years, the historical trauma, but also the ability of Indian people to fit in somewhere and to make a livelihood, to live.
I remember as a child that there was a fire here. Somebody's home was burning. And so you had fire trucks come, City of Phoenix, City of Tempe, and they're debating who has jurisdiction, who should be putting this fire out. And they do nothing because of liability, and the house burns down.
And the police brutality was so bad back then that the racism was so terrible, you know. In the dead cold winter, they would come down with their paddy wagons. They had a big, they call it the Black Mariah. It was a big black paddy wagon. They'd come down and load Indian people up. They'd go to the bar and just take them by the neck and throw them in. And if they didn't have enough room, they would actually handcuff Indian people around a light pole. And they'd sit there sometime like that in the snow or in the rain until they come back and make the other round and pick them up.
For me, it was probably the traditional Navajo life, the teachings of the Navajo people, the spoken words that the elderly tell you when you're still a young man about life, about education, about land, about people, the love, about the religion, about their character, the language and all of that. I could still hear a lot of those echoing through my own ears when I go about doing things on a daily basis, even here. So it's, I guess, in so many respects, the Great Spirit touching you to do certain things, to go certain route.
I joined with a group of young activists all over the country who went about challenging institutions, occupying buildings symbolically as a way to say we're taking back our land.
I have a dream.
The civil rights movement differed from the American Indian sovereignty and self-determination movement. Civil rights focused on eliminating segregation and supporting integration, while sovereignty was about reversing forced assimilation and protecting the tribal homelands.
What was happening in the churches was part of the changes that were occurring in the larger society, where there was more awareness about civil rights, particularly black civil rights, but could be easily translated to civil rights with American Indians. And that's sort of what happened, particularly the membership and leadership within the different denominations.
I saw it as the beginning, a door opening up to be able to maybe solicit support from the synods of the Lutheran Church, the interaction that was going on. They had programs, they had an Indian division, was my understanding, that handed out clothes, and we wanted more than clothes.
I always saw the problem as in two ways, or why they were different. The federal government wanted to assimilate Indians, which was that we would no longer exist, and they wanted to integrate other people of color. So when you look at those questions like that, then you can understand the dynamic of how you have to work in those communities.
A lot of people, when they do interviews and talk about the movement, they say the movement started here on Franklin Avenue here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. But for people like myself and Eddie Benson Benet and Dennis Fax and others, we knew that the movement began in prison. We wanted the community to give us a name. And after 2 weeks, I was confronted one day where these two ladies came into the office and pulled me outside and wanted to talk to me. And I went out there, and that's when they, why don't you call yourselves AIM? And I said, well, wow, what does that mean? It says American Indian Movement. And I said, well, we don't want to call Indians no more. This woman, she just kind of jerked her. She said, listen here, Sonny, she said, I mean, Indian is what they use to oppress us, and Indian is what we use to gain our freedom.
I came out of graduate school at Arizona State University having read these books about this great organizer called Saul Alinsky, and I went to Chicago on my own to learn from him. Well, simultaneously with actually my organizing in Chicago and training, Indian people were meeting with the Lutheran Church in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. The American Indian movement was challenging the churches, and particularly because the American Lutheran Church was headquartered in Minneapolis, they were challenging the Lutheran churches to establish a national board, to create a national staff, and to provide money for Indian organizing across the country.
In July of 1969, the three largest Lutheran bodies, the American Lutheran Church, the Lutheran Church of America, and the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, met with a group of Native Americans in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and formally accepted the concerns. However, the next formal meeting was not scheduled to be for 1 year. The Indian people couldn't wait.
We decided, well, let's really do this. Let's really go and take Alcatraz.
On November 20th, 1969, 80 Indians docked at Alcatraz Island and declared to the world that they were taking back Indian land.
We were the first generation of Indian people who were not subjugated to the government boarding schools where we were being controlled. We were in the cities, we were free, we could make our statements. We wanted to legitimize the fact that being Indian was okay and let them know that we still had a lot of issues back home that the federal government had never dealt with. The only time that I really was worried was towards the end when they wanted us off the island. They were hoping that we'd just all leave. We had an impact not only on our Indian people to be proud of who they were as Indian people, but it had an impact on a lot of people who were poor people or other minorities who have never had a voice.
Although the occupation lasted 19 months, it would be the first of many to receive national and international media attention.
With the demonstrations, this was something that the Southwestern Indian Development didn't do. We were really focused on our issues. We weren't focused on larger issues, but in fact really didn't see what was happening, except maybe going to a conference and hearing about it. But the driving force here was the community getting organized and going down and meeting and demonstrating to show what our positions were, what our concerns were.
The movement took hold. A lot of people became proud to be Indian again. They were lifted, they were, I hate to use that word, overused word, empowered.
Empowered also was the feeling and level of activism which increased throughout Indian country, including the Mohawk school boycotts, Cherokee protests over state hunting laws, Northwest Indian fish-ins, Navajo demonstrations against the exploitation of coal, Alaska Natives picketing over oil and gas development, and many other demonstrations.
I was asked to go to this meeting in Sioux Falls, South Dakota in 1970, which largely the American Indian movement was organizing in their challenging of the Lutheran churches. So I brought with me and organized constituencies of Dakota people. So if you could organize the churches, you could organize millions of people behind injustice, behind eradicating poverty, behind the issues that you were developing within your community.
I guess that's what struck home, and one of the reasons that Americans for Indian Opportunity spend so much time is a level of ignorance by the general public about Native Americans and tribes and tribal culture was just beyond. And then people of importance who were in decision-making positions were just heartbreaking. That here these people are making decisions in our behalf and they don't even know who we are, much less have any understanding about us.
When I went to work for the National Indian Youth Council, I entered an organization whose composition of the organization were young Indian people, highly educated. I mean, 4-year degrees, master's degrees, PhDs, lawyers and doctors. And there was me.
we set up a very loose agenda, and I knew from my experience in black confrontations that if there's a really militant group, they're going to say, here come the white people again, setting our agenda and telling us what we have. So I was introducing the program as we went on, wondering, well, when are they coming up? Because the agenda wasn't that great. But finally, Dennis Banks and Clyde Belcourt came up, and they said that you people are always telling us what we want. If we're here to do it, we have to get together first and decide what we're going to say to you. And so we're going to have an Indian caucus, and I'm asking all the Indian people here to walk with us. And so out they walked, and these Lutheran structured people were just sitting and dumbfounded because, you know, they were paying for this meeting, and these people were walking out, and they wanted to set the agenda. And it was sort of comical, but it was frightening for a lot of people who had never been in that situation before. They said, well, when will they come back? And I said, I don't know. They're going to determine that. And what will we be talking about? I don't know, I would say.
And as a result, a national board was organized, and we put forward the challenges of a national staff position and millions of dollars to support Indian organizing and needs across the country. But since the church did not respond, AIM, in its protesting style, took over one of the dormitories and demanded that the national executives respond and approve the elected board before the dormitory would be released.
We, of course, chained up all the doors and locked them. Nobody could get in. There was a lot of people on the outside that supported us. So we told them right flat out that we were not going to leave there until the three presidents of those three Lutheran synods called and said that they would abide by those challenges.
Lutheran churches had executives from throughout the country, even though not the top leaders, who were supporting this effort. We were also provided with an assurance that we did not have to be converting Indian people to Christianity.
Working with groups in Denver and with National Indian Lutheran Board was to begin to see the phenomenal leadership of persons involved in the community, and not just to see the poverty, the difficulty of life. What NILB helped us to do was to see potential, to see people with phenomenal skills who wanted to give those skills to help the quality of life be increased for all that they had a chance to work with.
One of the most influential men of the time was Eugene Crawford, the first American Indian hired as executive director of the National Indian Lutheran Board. His Dakota family had been exiled from Minnesota after the 1862 Dakota War.
I was checking in and started to go down to get rid of my luggage, and Gene jumped up, and Russell Means was coming in to register at the hotel, and Gene just picked him up by the neck and kind of pushed him, pulled him around like this and said, darn you, usually a little stronger verse. Darn you, Russell, said, we've been trying to help you, and now I hear you're bad-mouthing me. And he said, no, Gene, no, I didn't do that. So I was very impressed, I must say, because I was always a little intimidated by Russell myself.
We used to have a lot of arguments with Gene, you know, what we thought he should do, what programs should be funded, but he had his own way of doing things. We always compromised on it. We just never got our way with him, and I think that's why we were effective, because we had people like him.
In the beginning, we knew little or nothing about the Lutheran structure, and by the same token, the Lutheran structure knew nothing about the Indian world. So it's always been an ongoing priority with the National Indian Lutheran Board to develop bridges and understanding between the two worlds.
City wood. The clouds now hide the moon.
Floyd Red Crow Westerman was also a Dakota exile from Minnesota who became a musician, an activist, and a well-known Hollywood actor. He served the American Indian social justice movement through both his songs and political work. He is perhaps best remembered for his album, Custer Died for Your Sins, based on the book written by leading American Indian scholar Vine Deloria Jr.
Custer died for your
I had the opportunity to meet Floyd for the first time when we did a concert together, and I believe it was in California. And I always was amazed with that really rich baritone voice of his and that really warm smile, but yet he commanded the stage because he owned it every time that he got out there. He was very wise. You know, he went through a lot to do what he did as well. Anyone that was involved back then in the movement, whether it be in music or whatever, if you were singing out what was called back then protest songs, you didn't have it easy. Floyd was an example of someone that everything he said, whether it be in song or word, came right from the heart.
You see the trail of shadows running.
History sort of defined a relationship amongst a group of us that formed a network around the National Indian Lutheran Board. There was Vine Deloria, who was becoming the emerging contemporary writer and legal scholar of the time. There was Floyd Westerman, who was the emerging Indian musician and actor. There was Eugene Crawford, who was really in one sense, our symbolic and leading figure of the National Lutheran Board, who was an educator. And then myself, who was a young organizer. All of us came through the exile and ended up in South Dakota.
I look at the very broad spectrum of grants that were given and the impact on various communities to address poverty, to address hunger. I know of incidents where people would have had nothing to eat for probably days if it had not been able to access a food bank or a soup kitchen. There were grants for helping build a longhouse up in the Northwest. A canning factory was established. It provided income for some of the employees. The grants never exceeded $4,500. The reason for the limit of $4,500 is this could have been like seed money, which would generate money from other organizations. It could be seed money for government projects. It could be seed money to bring other churches into partnership with the Lutheran churches. They were responding to a human need, and that's what we're supposed to be about as people. We are supposed to be in partnership with others.
If you were an Indian community sending in a request for a grant, the requirements for that Indian community, because the Indians were imposing it, was tougher than most granting organizations were. They were supposed to come in with a report every quarter on how they're spending their money. And if it wouldn't be there, they would withdraw it, you know. In other words, the Indians who were making their proposals weren't just coming in for a gravy train. They had to really press their cause and justify what they were requesting.
NILB for me stands out as the perfect example of how to conduct ourselves as people of faith, and how to reach out to and to be reached, and to embrace and to be embraced, and to listen and then to be listened to, and then to partner up and to work together.
When I first came to work at Indian Rehabilitation, that was in 1979, our total funding, including running the program and salaries, was $30,000 a year. One of my first experiences was meeting Joel Schlachtenhofen with Lutheran Ministries, and they were helping us with some of the grassroots needs that we had. They were renovating our kitchen, and we got funding from the National Indian Lutheran Board. And they helped us get our program in compliance, you know, with health compliance and those kind of things. They also funded some of our needs around just supplying food for people on a daily basis, those that were homeless on the street, and also the men that were eating congregate meals in our program.
November 1972. A caravan of over 800 Indian people traveled across America and arrived in Washington, D.C. They planned to meet with Bureau of Indian Affairs officials and deliver what is known as the 20-point proposal.
The Rick and the Moon
1972, the National Indian Lutheran Board supported the American Indian March on Washington, D.C. with transportation, food assistance, and housing the marchers in local churches all along the way.
I remember one specific incident with the National Indian Lutheran Board. AIM had come to Washington, D.C. when the Congress was in recess. Nixon was in California, and so were most of the cabinet members. By the time they arrived, they had the authority to meet with them. You know how bureaucracies are, they're afraid of their shadow. So nobody would meet with them out of frustration. They just took over the bureau and stayed there till somebody was going to pay attention to them.
That was my first week as director of the National Congress of American Indians, and I think I didn't sleep much during that entire week of the activity. Our efforts didn't work. AIM pretty much ignored us, so we generally stood by. If we were needed, we hoped to be able to help.
Margaret Gover and I went down because we heard there were Oklahoma Indians who had come in their long walk to Washington, and we wanted to see if there were any relatives of ours. So we went down, and John Goodell saw us, and he said, "There's Don and Margaret. Come on, come on in." Of course, they was like the Red Sea had opened up and let us in, and the U.S. Marshals were going to attack the building with all these Indian people of all ages in there. And so I decided, well, at least one thing, I'm a senator's wife, I could stay in there and they wouldn't attack the building with me in there. And so I started calling and they said, "Well, now who are y'all talking to?" And I said, "Tell them that you were ready to negotiate and tell them that to set it up with their people in authority." And they did, and the people in authority said, "Well, we don't have the authority to negotiate," but they had the authority to attack them. I thought that was such a wild, crazy thing.
In a movement, eventually nobody has control. If there's so many people involved, no one person can really decide what's going on. And people get frustrated and things begin to occur. The National Lutheran Board was one of the leaders in the aftermath of the occupation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs building in Washington, D.C., to organize a national network to create a national response focusing on the real issues facing Indian communities.
When AIM and other Native people left Washington, D.C., the FBI classified AIM as an extremist organization and added the names of its leaders to a list of key extremists in the United States.
One of the stories related to the movement of the times and the activism that were taking place is that the Justice Department, all the way from the FBI to the local police force, were assigning police officers to monitor and develop some type of a relationship with the Indian groups. In Phoenix, Arizona, where I was organizing with Southwestern Development, a police officer by the name of Rudy Santa Cruz was assigned to us. And even though we weren't the American Indian movement in Phoenix, we were assigned a police officer.
We established a good rapport with them, and in some ways, at least for me, it gave me some assurance that they were there and that they could document that we weren't doing anything out of sorts and that we were nonviolent protesters, demonstrators, and that we had legitimate issues.
One day I asked Rudy, I said, "Rudy, where is the AIM caravan today?" He would leave and come back and say, "They're going down Highway 66 in an old beat-up truck with an Indian with a red headband and a cigarette in his mouth with a drum tied in the back of the truck." What else do you want to know?
One region that was truly in need of help was the border area around Pine Ridge, South Dakota. Many Indian beatings and unsolved murders had occurred, and racial tensions were about to explode.
The leadership of Wounded Knee were making their own decisions. They were deciding what they wanted. But on the outside, the whole world was watching the 71-day takeover. And the federal government was trying to figure out, how do we respond to this without major violence further occurring, without hundreds of people being killed? Although the National Lutheran Board was not involved in the actual occupation of Wounded Knee, it monitored the siege with the National Council of Churches and worked to establish a national bail bond fund for possible arrests and trials.
The advocacy issues that NILB got us into were complicated because you had to listen to, as pastors and congregations, the concerns and fears of your members, but at the same time have a teaching task of helping them to understand that God is really calling us to what's good for all people, and therefore needing to look at the opposite side to say, is this what God is calling us to at this point in time?
After the takeover of Wounded Knee, the leadership of AIM was so caught up in legal issues and court cases that they no longer could participate on the National Lutheran Board. The National Indian Lutheran Board continued to organize all over the country and on national issues, working with the other coalitions in Washington, D.C. and related to the tribal and urban communities.
In the early 1970s, a third of Native people fell below the government's official poverty level. The average U.S. income was $10,429, compared to Native earnings of $5,226. Along with the basic needs of the family, health care was one of the biggest issues.
I'm from Pine Ridge, and as a resident of Pine Ridge, I saw some of the devastating effects of the diseases and the problems and the conditions. Polio was a prime problem when I was growing up, 1950s. Alcoholism, substance abuse, suicides, STDs, cancer, particularly diabetes, were pretty rampant on the reservations.
The issues of health care and unrecognized tribes were brought to us by the National Congress of American Indians, by LaDonna Harris, who was organizing all Indian strategies in Washington, D.C., and by Vine Deloria, who was really the philosopher of the sovereignty movement.
In our urban hearings, one of the things that we made a point was just because Indians did not live on the reservation, under the treaty, we were entitled to services wherever we were.
One of the dynamics of getting this national network together was it gave us enough people to not only write legislation and get them presented to Congress and get Congress to pass them, but enough people to get the support of the president to sign the legislation so it became law.
Lutheran Council in the United States of America was a way in which the different church bodies came together to do some forms of ministry, such as the Indian ministry through National Indian Lutheran Board. So it brought together church bodies that didn't work in lots of other ways together, but around these concerns could say, we are of one mind, we want to be supportive here. And that led to being able to be useful in Washington because there was an office related to the Lutheran Council that helped do advocacy work, which assisted with some of the major issues that the Indian community was working on.
We got the church groups involved in this as a civil rights, human rights issue. We brought all our allies because I had been working outside the Senate in all of these different organizations because that's what I'd been doing back home. And Fred then in the Senate could use his skills to get it out of committee.
The real key there was when it came together as a law and it was lobbied through Congress pretty much intact. Office of Management and Budget, the president's own chief advisor in these issues, was strongly pushing for a veto. And there were people on Capitol Hill who didn't vote for the legislation that were hoping that it would be vetoed and were pushing for it.
One of these organizations was that there was called Congressional Wives, and we'd have a meeting every so many months as a way of socializing.
LaDonna Harris was a friend of Betty Ford, and calling Betty Ford and urging that tonight over tea, why don't you talk to the president about this? And sure enough, it worked. I don't know how much that had to do with it, but I would think it had. So that was true. We were sweating it. We didn't know that it would be signed by him, and he signed it courageously, but with an awful lot of good pressure.
There was a lot done with different issues of advocacy, And one of them, where I worked in Denver, really came from the passion of a woman who had lived in the Northwest and was involved with us in trying to build education and awareness around Indian concerns. And treaty rights around fishing were a big issue for her, having experienced that in the Northwest. So she was trying to help all of us to understand the way the treaties functioned and the way that gave an advantage to the Indian community in salmon fishing. And of course, we learned, as we heard this, that this was not terribly popular with even Lutherans who were involved in the fishing industry. And that as advocacy was being done in this area, there were divisive conversations. The community was divided about, should the Lutheran Church be having anything to do with this? Why should these treaties still be supported? Isn't this a new day? Shouldn't we be able to move on? Well, the issue may be a little bit different, but it still is a time for us to be looking at how those treaties need to be continued to be supported.
After the passage of the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act in 1976, one of the major problems was that you had to be federally recognized in order to receive the service. And most Indian people in the United States were not federally recognized. So that's where we had to go next, to work with the unrecognized tribes.
Due to lack of resources and difficult conditions on the reservations, most tribes did not have the capacity to fulfill the government's arduous procedures to regain recognition. It was through the support of the National Native Network, of which NILB was a part, that many tribes successfully reclaimed their federal recognition, and others advanced their claims to be recognized for the first time.
I remember being at a meeting in Tempe, Arizona, and this Yaqui Indian man came to our meeting by the name of Anselmo Valencia. And he came and asked us to support the Yaqui people, who were actually people from both Mexico and the United States, get federal recognition. And so the National Lutheran Board took that on as our first effort to work with a non-recognized tribe. And we provided money and we helped write the legal analysis that the Yaquis needed to petition for federal recognition.
We have our own language, we have our own religion, our own culture, and even though there was an artificial boundary between the U.S. and Mexico, it did not take away our Indianness, our Indian identity. So this community, along with many other Yaqui communities in the Tucson and Phoenix area, they were not reservations. They were Yaqui communities settled by the early families coming to the Arizona territory, escaping political persecution.
Well, with recognition with the Yaqui tribe, I think the main thing was to have land ownership. That differed from the other tribes in the sense that there was many civil rights issues that came along with that. The other tribes could focus more on those issues, and whereas the Yaqui tribe had some real basic issues, which was just living, having a place to live, having a community to be a part of.
Anselmo Valencia told me how many of those elected officials were saying, why should we give you federal recognition? We did not have a war with you. And Anselmo Valencia turned and said, okay, that is true, but you know what? If that's all it's going to take, then I will go home tomorrow, organize, because we still have our military societies, declare war on the U.S. government, and yes, we're going to lose in a matter of seconds. Will you then give us federal recognition? And I think they were embarrassed by his comment and his challenge.
So the National Tribal Chairmen's Association was formed, and they're the ones also that fought against the recognition of small tribes. That if we allow more small tribes to get recognized, that cuts the pie into thinner slices, you know, the big federal budget pie, and we all get fewer dollars. Kind of separated us when we really needed all the unity we could get.
A piece of this history is a weird piece that I really mentally cannot understand, are the Lumbee people from North Carolina. They have been so abused through the years through their efforts of trying to get federal recognition.
The largest unrecognized tribe that the National Lutheran Board worked with was the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina. The Lumbees had been struggling for over 100 years to get full federal recognition.
So we got all these great people together, these great organizations thinking, boy, this will be smooth, and we get the National Congress to back us up and then change the regulations in Washington. We'll do this. We just ran into a blank wall. Those of us who have been working with these groups were amazed at the resistance. I saw personally as a great political move of bringing more Indians to have more numbers, but for some reason the National Congress turned it down.
Early on, the Lumbee came to join the National Congress of American Indians and came to the convention and were declined by the Credentials Committee because you have to be a tribe with a governing body. And they could never convince NCAI that they were a tribe. They came as a development corporation.
We provided them with dollars to do additional legal work, to help rewrite their petitions, to help advocate to the National Congress of American Indians and other national bodies to get behind and support the Lumbee issue. The challenging part of the Lumbee issue was because there are so many of them, their numbers would challenge the federal Indian budget. And so money became the issue. You know, if the Lumbees got recognized, there were not more federal dollars allocated, and they would take away much of the money for many of the other tribes. So the fear of that resulted in other tribes not supporting the Lumbees.
So many more tribes have been recognized, and it hasn't caused the budget crash that a lot of the more fearful tribal leaders were projecting.
March 28, 1979. Tragedy strikes the east coast of the United States with the nuclear meltdown of 3 Mile Island, receiving international attention. However, months later on the Navajo Reservation, the largest accidental release of radioactive material in U.S. history occurred at Church Rock. A uranium tailing dam burst, sending 1,100 tons of radioactive mill waste and 90 million gallons of contaminated liquid pouring into the Rio Puerco River.
I also remember right about that time, 3 Mile Island, and how that was in the news, on television all the time. The same thing happened on the Navajo Reservation among the Indian people, among the Navajo people. And you didn't hear about it anywhere.
The release of millions of gallons of waste material from the uranium mill into the Rio Puerco River has created a long-standing concern from the communities in Pinedale chapter through Church Rock chapter, all the way down the watershed into the state of Arizona, because the Rio Puerco does flow quite a bit, and it eventually contributes to the Little Colorado River, which then contributes to the Colorado River.
There wasn't the general public response that you would expect, nor did the governmental, or the response of the various governments, state and federal, seem to be a real alert and concern to the issue. A professor of physics from Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota, spent a year there. People that were brought in with an NILB grant from around the country, panel of 5, and they made their assessments and made their recommendations for how things more properly would be done in the future with regard to regulating the mines and monitoring the effect of those mines.
In April of 2005, the Navajo Nation Council considered a law called the Diné Natural Resources Protection Act, and that law was a proposal to ban uranium mining and milling. It was received with overwhelming support and was enacted into law.
Energy is important. A lot of our energy is through water, but that's going to diminish as water diminishes. So, the future of the Southwest particularly as well as in other parts of the country, really are in the hands of Indian people. So those are the two interrelated issues that tribes are going to have to strategize on and work out and really become an important player at the table for the future of the Southwest.
The National Lutheran Board, which was organized in 1970, came to an end in 1988. It came to an end with the reorganizing of the Lutheran churches. The Lutheran Church Missouri Synod pulled out of the Lutheran Council USA, which was the platform which the National Lutheran Board attached itself in a parallel body to these three churches.
The Missouri Synod did not really intend to back away from Indian concerns, but there, in this new grouping, where an ultra-conservative group became the leadership in the Missouri Synod, decided we don't want to be doing this with the American Lutheran Church and the Lutheran Church of America, with those two church bodies, because we don't think that they're quite with us in faith matters.
When the Lutheran churches reorganized, they began to focus inward rather than outward. When they focused inward, they wanted to assimilate the National Lutheran Board into the newly formed Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. So there would no longer be a National Lutheran Board.
We lost our grant process, which was very harmful to the communities that depended on the partnership of the Lutheran churches. We didn't have the authority to provide those grants again.
One of the things that I think was lost in the formation of the new Lutheran Church and the desk, Native American desk, was the strong self-determination that was a part of the National Indian Lutheran Board in the new structure. It's taken a long time for us to get to the point where we realize that that is a tremendous loss that took place.
Though the combined resources of the National Indian Lutheran Board may have been lost, the core network of leaders remains to develop communities, whether they're urban or whether they're on the reservation, and continue to work to break down barriers between the two.
So we made a commitment and a decision among the leadership that we would all go back home. So I came back here at Minneapolis, and I think things just kind of mushroomed. And I ran into a man by the name of Dr. Leon Sullivan. He's one of Martin Luther King's #1 lieutenant, one of the prime organizers in the South. And he told the people there in that room, all his black leadership, by the end of this year, he said, we're going to have an Indian arm of OICs of America, and this young man here is going to run it. We've trained over 30,000 people. We took 26,000 right off from welfare rolls and put them on payroll in our job training program. Then we started developing Little Earth in our tribe. We've created the Indian Health Board, the first urban Indian health program in the nation. Our Legal Rights Center, I went to a board meeting 2 months ago, celebrated their 60,000th case. I like to see the whole avenue lined up with Indian programs, Indian business. That's the heart of our community.
Well, on Franklin Avenue, we're trying to bring together tribal resources with urban human capital and financial capital, and targeting a particular physical location, which is Franklin Avenue, where there's enough consolidation of land by now to actually build out a physical cultural corridor. Along with Franklin Avenue, there are other projects developing across the country, one of which I've been working with is Native American Connections in Phoenix, Arizona.
So now, 29 years later, we have 110 employees. We have about a $7 million operating budget. We serve about 75% Native people and 25% whoever touches our door. Now we own 15 sites around the valley. We have housing for seniors. We have housing for people with HIV and AIDS. We have housing for women coming out of domestic violence shelters where it's not safe for them to go back home and they need a helping hand to start again. We have a shelter called Pendleton Court that can just reach out its hand to women out on the streets. Maybe they're having addiction to meth or alcohol addiction and they're out on the streets with their children, and they can come into Pendleton Court.
I saw it growing from really a vision, a dream, to a place that needed a lot of work, to something that really was becoming very strong and had a great future, and that proved to be the case.
I think the future is bright. The young people should tahan. Means the young people will be raised, get educated, they'll come back, they'll take us. That's the duty of the young people.
All of the colonial countries now, their people are coming back from their colonial countries and coming into their countries, so that it's a whole new world. How do we coexist in this world and be able to maintain our cultural and political autonomy? How do we maintain our indigeneity, we call it?
Well, we live increasingly within a global environment where more people with differences are coming into interaction with each other. And so we can either become more at odds with each other, or we find the area where we are one with each other and break down the barriers of separation globally as well as locally.
Kota oyate ki ha. Kokata kia maunipte, yushkia, wash agia maunikte. We are people. We will walk towards the future with strength and power and compassion.
We've seen how war and social issues and religious and cultural misunderstandings divide and separate us. There are lessons to be learned from Native people and religious leaders who stand up together and act as one unified force for change. But we'll never solve one problem or resolve one issue until we change our thinking and learn to relate to one another without the need to dominate, control, or destroy. I'm Peter Coyote. Thank you for watching.
This story of the National Indian Lutheran Board represents a historic period in the relationship between Lutheran churches and American Indian and Alaska Native people. We share this experience to demonstrate that culturally unique communities and leaders can find a common voice for overcoming social injustice and expressing civil rights. The Evangelical Lutheran Church in America has reaffirmed its commitment for American Indian sovereignty and self-determination with this documentary production of Native nations standing together for civil rights. This team of producers from the Native American community shared their history and talents to put this program together. We are all in relationship, one with one another. The Evangelical Lutheran Church in America will continue doing what our predecessor church bodies began. We continue God's work with our hands.
So you can see it's a little dated, but it's good information. And this is a film that recently has been getting more light shed on it because we're having these conversations more and more. And I hope you can also see why we need kind of an act 2 on this, where some of these elders are more elderly now and some are no longer with us. So it'd be wonderful to dive into some of those pieces. And I know I made a joke about having 400,000, but I recently looked at the short that I co-directed, which we'll watch later this afternoon. I was in an incredible relationship with a donor who produced, was intending to produce several films on the world of human trafficking and awareness. And the money that we put into our short film, which is 18 minutes long versus what you put into a film that's an hour long, is significantly different. So yeah, we're like, we need $400,000 to really pull off like the basic of pieces with today's technology. So hopefully we'll see an Act 2. Maybe we'll do a crowdfunding of sorts to produce that and to celebrate where we've come now, because some of the work that I got to be a part of within my position is actually seeing more team programs, theological education programs develop across the country within different synods, different pathways for Native lay leaders to become ordained leaders, and newer pathways to establish that education without the need to become an ordained leader. That was such a pressure for my generation and others to be, all right, if you should go to seminary, you're a leader, you should go to seminary. Well, I toured Luther, I didn't like it. I didn't like going to seminary. It was too academic for me, or too restrictive, or I felt where I wouldn't belong here, right? Like I just don't belong here, I'm too different. Those learning environments have changed significantly since I toured in the early 2000s, and now we have incredible programs. Actually, the team program, the Native Theological Education Program, is actually coming to Portland today, and they'll be here all week, so they're educating in Portland. So we have Alaska Native leaders, Southwest Native leaders from the Navajo Nation, Dakota and Lenape leaders from South Dakota, and New York coming in to like learn here in Portland. So I'm excited to see them later. I just found out they're coming, and I was like, what? I posted on Facebook that I was here, and they're like, we're here too. I mean, we're not there yet, but we will be. And I was like, that's awesome. So I helped start that program with Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary down in Berkeley, California. Or is it Oakland? I always get them confused because they're right there. Berkeley, yeah. Now part of the Kalu family, right? So PLTS has been an incredibly receptive host for that program because they're not pressuring any of us to become ordained at the end of it. Now, traditional seminary pushed us to become ordained leaders, and we're like, we can't make that promise, you know? The intensive training that you get as pastors to think deeply and critically about your faith and how you're showing up in your faith, and then lead that in community is different from those of us who have roots here in this country in our own cultural programming and belief systems that may differ from those traditional seminary educational environments. And so we didn't want Native leaders, Indigenous leaders to be like, well, you can't be that if you're going to be this, right? How do we merge and marry those differences in a system that works for all of us so that we can sense that self-viability, that I can be a leader in this church too. I can be an ordained leader in this church too, right? So that's something that I got to be a part of. And I'm really proud of building the relationships with the Native ministries that we have across the footprint of this church that is now being furthered. We got incredible leadership at both churchwide and beyond. So we will debrief the film when we get back from lunch, but I wanted you all to have just some time to see what my next, So we'll debrief the film after lunch. I want you to sit with some of those pieces. But I hope you think about some of the themes that popped up even during that time. Like, how are we showing up as church? Do treaties matter, right? The bureaucracy of the church and how we want to shift into supportive new environments. I mean, I think it was clear, like I said earlier, it was a miracle Missouri Synod was even involved with the National Indian Lutheran Board, but they were also one of the first to say, we're out, right? And that challenged the other structures of the church and leadership of the church to be like, should we stay in or should we stay out? And I think the death and loss of June Crawford really gave them that, like, oh, we don't have to do it now. Cool, we got our out, right? And because we didn't deepen that bench. We didn't deepen that bench of Native leaders. And now there's more of us across the footprint of the church. Share that picture again, where there's more of us. Sure, we've lost some of these folks since then. Poor, I forget Joanne's nephew's name. He's got an Irish name. It'll come to me. But he was like, I don't want to be here, Grandma. But now he's like, he loves coming to these gatherings. He'll be here in Portland this weekend. So some of these folks are on their pathway to getting ordained, and a lot of these Native leaders are actually in the teen program coming to Portland this weekend. So I'm excited to see them now. That it was a really cool surprise. So Steph, great planning, great planning. So a wonderful surprise to my being out here. With that, I always kind of defer to the group if you want to offer a prayer for your lunch service before we break. Yeah. No, but that's part one for today.
Thank you. Good and gracious God, we give you thanks for this day. We give you thanks for opening our minds and teaching us. Help us to be receptive. Help us to receive this food with gratefulness and these conversations as a beginning. In your precious name we pray. Amen.
So sorry, I forget I talk really loud. You can go use the restroom, stretch out, warm up somewhere. And our lunch will be, they're madly preparing lunch back there. So just so you know that our menu today is salmon, chicken, Three Sisters stew, which is potato, black bean, corn, and squash. Yes, thank you. Yeah.
But I always joke with our nation we have four sisters. Because we have beans, corn, squash, different multitudes of varieties of them, and then sunflowers are our fourth sister because the nitrogen it throws into the earth. So.
And then we have roasted root vegetables. We have pumpkin with native rice in it. Where is it from? Minnesota native rice. And then for dessert, we'll be stuck with our sweetbreads. But there will be plenty of food, so please enjoy. And everything that is not the salmon and chicken is vegetarian. So welcome to lunch.